It's nice to be here, and I'm going to talk about how women-led businesses are essentially supporting MSMEs and stand for human-centered entrepreneurship. I'll do that by the medium of the organization I lead called AHANA. So, essentially, when we talk commerce, there are two pillars of commerce that ideally are core and should be partners, but somehow they're not connected easily. And that is on one side, if you look at B2B buyers, and on the other side, if you look at authentic producers that essentially are the backbones of the entire MSME industry. And when you look at authentic buyers that essentially create impact products, they form a core backbone. And B2B buyers, when you look at them, they are at a stage where while on one side they have to fulfill the requirements, currently with this evolving scenario, they're facing huge ESG and reputational risks because they are not able to verify their sourcing pipelines often. And hence the concept of AHANA, which I founded around 3 years ago, came in, where we would like to be the enablers for addressing this gap, where on one side you have these buyers, on the other side you have these producers, but they lack the network, the access, and often resources to access the market. So what we are is essentially an ecosystem platform where on one side we have verified MSMEs that we curate that essentially are curated through a very strict criteria, which I will explain, and we connect them to the global market. And there are two core values that we curate them on, and that form the base of our foundation. And this is where I'd like to explain the first value, because whenever we talk about indigenous arts, crafts, we talk about artisanship, there is a touch of emotion that is brought in where we say, oh, we need to preserve them because otherwise it will die out. And how will the progeny and future understand? I would like to turn the tables by having us rethink that way and essentially look at these as tools of modern engineering, because if you look at a lot of indigenous arts, crafts, and the way these communities have evolved is they have learned these through oral communication, and often they're not numeracy or letter literate, but they're able to pass the craft on by understanding, by adopting frameworks, which when we look through the modern engineering lens, is actually very scientific and involves engineering, because the imagination of these patterns, these motives, and all the way they create these beautiful pieces essentially is something to be applauded and appreciated, that how these generational knowledge was passed on. So essentially we should look at that as more of a tool for modern engineering to learn, rather than I need to preserve it. So that's one turning of table, and as a core value we look at, where these are valued as tools of communication and learning rather than just pure preservation. The next is circularity. The current times we are living at, where we've actually moved on to consumption, overconsumption rampantly, where it's a take, make, waste world, is where the concept of circularity has become all the more important, where we need to look at our supply chains again, and we need to apply what I would say is human centered, but not just human centered, humanity centered design thinking, that whenever we are creating something, what is the end of life of that product? Where will that product go in? And how is it going to affect the environment, the society in general, as it heads to its end of life? And that requires thinking not just in terms of the virgin raw materials we use, but also the post use. So pre and post consumer, how does the material, the product, fit into supply chains? What can be done about it? So essentially, that mindset has to be brought in so that we could take steps to work on these, materials, raw materials, and also post-pre, and see how they can further be reconverted and brought into either the same or different supply chains to prolong, the existence of the items, or essentially even prolong the customer lifetime value. So with these two core binding values, the way we operate, and I think the way impact MSMEs could look at operating would be what we call as our three-pillar approach. And these three-pillar approaches are as shown here, and I'll take you through them one by one. So the first one is essentially a market access. Now, there are businesses that need to be connected to the market. So of course you can, create another platform, right? There can be another marketplace, another way to connect them to the market. But I think what is really important is, are we taking the right steps to enable these businesses to be connecting to the market, or just creating another platform? And that's where our approach comes in, where there are strong steps taken to audit, verify, to check the supply chains to see whether, you know, we are walking the talk, whether we are mindful of which materials we are using, how they are producing, whether the employees are being paid fair, whether there is any child labor involved, whether the working conditions are humane, and all those aspects need to be looked at and verified. And what essentially buyers need is to have that peace of mind that whoever they're buying from have been audited, vetted, and there is traceability, so that you know where your products are coming from. And it's become all the more critical to do this with all the new guidelines coming in. And especially, I think Europe is leading the pack in this with all the latest guidelines on traceable supply chains with extended producers responsibility. So that's what we try to do, that we, while we are curating, we are making sure that whoever we are working with is essentially following the principles of culture, environment, and social sustainability. The next pillar that comes in is, while we are doing that, how are you actually enabling, your suppliers and your customers on the other side to be able to walk the path, right? So connecting the products is one part, but I think there's a very important knowledge flow that has to happen, and that's where a lot of advisory and support comes in, wherein to move towards a greener supply chain requires steps and guidance. And working with our partners hand in hand has become super critical to know the latest guidelines, to know how to work with them, because essentially it's, when we look at MSMEs, unlike larger businesses, they do not have the budgets to do a complete switch. And hence, taking a step-by-step approach and trying to, address one of the key parts of the value chain, which could bring in the biggest results, is what comes in. And essentially, that's the approach we take. And for the customers on the other side, there's this huge narrative on ESG, that these steps, need to be taken. But what we have to understand from the customer's lens is, for them to work on these while, in a way, stepping away from their core is quite difficult. And also, not everyone can rely on the big four to take them through, because the costs are often exploitative and really high. And when you look at, say, mid-sized companies, being on the other side of the buying, value chain as customers, they need bite-size, possibly modular kind of support. And that's why we come in, where the whole idea is to break it down. The whole idea is to simplify it and help them understand that how, by taking these steps, they can move along the ESG value chain within their business. Buying consciously is one part of it, but also there are steps that could be taken that can help them move, their move down their journey, and at the same time fulfill a lot of regulatory requirement and address business risks, which has, become all the more critical in the current environment we operate in. So essentially, that's how we balance the two parts. And the third one is regenerative enablement. So, as I told you, one of the core pillars has been circularity. And while on one side you could talk about products and knowledge flow, what becomes critical is how do you close the loop, right? How do you bring in the circularity aspects? How do you connect these parties? So, of course, buying products is one, but the other is when you're working with a lot of grassroots level communities and businesses, helping them move along their knowledge management capacity building becomes quite critical. And one ways businesses can make a difference is if they become part of it, using their CSV budgets to do that. And that's another way they are able to essentially help their supply chain eventually, because these are the people who are their, suppliers. And on the other side, tick a box by essentially, fulfilling their CSR requirements, which can help them in their, ESG regulatory ratings. So with this three-pillar approach, you're essentially able to lead and a more I would say, conscious business principles that are essentially centered around humanity centered rather than human centered design or development. I would say humanity centered. Now, the SDGs that become critical as when you take this kind of approach, of course, are quite a few. You are looking at minimizing poverty because you're enabling smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses. Women play an essential role, and this is where I'd like to emphasize. I share a statistics more, which is more representing my part of the world, but largely, more than 60% of MSMEs are women-led businesses. And Indonesia, where we are headquartered, it's actually 80% of these MSMEs. So already you're trying to bring in more women-led businesses and hence allowing more balance in the value chain. And of course, decent work and economic growth. We are trying to reduce inequalities and we are trying to create sustainable cities and communities because you're trying to essentially bring in long-term, business sustainability. Using better materials leads to responsible consumption and production, and climate action, which we see happening. I mean, the effects of climate change we see happening all the time. I think as we take conscious steps towards minimizing the negative, we are trying to move towards taking some steps on climate action, right? And eventually, all these goals come together. Yeah, they have to work in cohesion, synergy with each other, and hence the partnership of goals, SDG 17, becomes super critical. We've been around for 3 years and we've had a very collaborative and consultative approach. So the idea is not to just focus on a particular geography, but actually look at which businesses are more aligned on the core ethos and values. So essentially, the way we try to work is as long as the businesses are following and stepping and working on culture, environment, and social sustainability, we'd like to curate them, work with them, because the idea is to see what can be achieved by working together rather than doing it separately. And essentially, starting from Indonesia, we work with India, and there are expansion nodes. So we work in Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam. And this is not limited to a particular geography. This is representative of the way MSMEs have been operating, if I may say, across the majority countries. So hence, there is a huge potential for these businesses to be able to work together to supply to each other rather than just, look at each other as competitions. And I'm not going to linger on this slide, but the whole idea is the value can be provided across, multiple customer streams and across different sectors. So this just represents what we have done. And this is my final slide. What I want to emphasize here is I think the approach and the mindset that is needed when we are looking at a collaborative, cohesive partnership approaches. We're not looking at customers as customers, but you should consider them as guardians. You should consider them as including them in part of your supply chain, your value chain. And the idea is then you can explore various ways to work with your customers and include them in your journey. First is, of course, they buy your product, so procuring. But the other would be that how what they buying is one way, but through knowledge, through their programs, can they collaborate and help co-create? So there's a lot of partnerships opportunities that can be explored in the value chain, towards creating more sustainable as MSMEs, and also leading to better businesses fulfilling their requirements. Thank you for your patient listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Aparna, for hearing your speech on women-led MSMEs driving inclusive trade and human-centered entrepreneurship. Thank you. Thank you once again.